The designer of this particular rear garden wants to display the design on a single sheet. Let's go to that single sheet, and you can see in the layout space the sheet's been referred to as a plan. If we right click on that and go to the layouts manager, you can see that she's chosen an A3 size sheet in landscape view. You might also note that there are 6 objects in that layout or paper size view, so let's just cancel from there. So we're looking here at a sheet of paper. We can zoom out. So here's a grey background representing a desk, and a sheet of paper is lying on the desk. This designer has put the design in a floating viewport, and let me select that floating viewport. I'll just do a single click there, and you can see I've picked the edge of a floating viewport. Over in the properties box it says viewport. You might also notice that view scale is set at 50, so it's a 1:50 view on an A3 sheet and fixed scale. So we've got one floating viewport. What I'll do at the moment is change the colour. When you want to plot it and you don't want to see the frame of that viewport, make the colour 255, 255, 255. What I'll do now is just change that colour to say a green so we can see that floating viewport. But you'll notice here a plant schedule, and that's also in a floating viewport, and it gets a little tricky to pick. I can see a white border to it. Again, I'll make that the same green colour so that in future we'll be able to pick the viewports. So let me right click and zoom extents. So the main part of the design sits inside a viewport, a floating viewport with a fixed scale. That's that one there. Let's pick it. That's the larger floating viewport. The plant schedule itself sits inside a much smaller floating viewport, which is on top of the earlier one. That's often quite difficult to pick, and that's why I've pushed that slightly up so that I can select it easily. If the smaller viewport that holds the plant schedule was inside the other one, it gets quite difficult to pick, so I've moved it in that way. I will move it down a little because we want the word plant schedule to show, and I'll increase the size of it like so. So now I can still pick it easily as I can pick the other one. So that's a fixed scale of 50, but this one is a view scale which is not fixed. It happens to be 69.5. You already know that if you want to adjust, say, the content, if you like, of that floating viewport, you just double click on it, and here we have a magenta box which we can position. I might want to play with it a little, and to display it again you right click and say display it on the layout. When you return to a layout space, you get a dotted line around that layout, and it's important. If I right click here, you notice that it just says activate viewport. What that would do is activate the viewport immediately under my cursor. If I move up here in the outside of that larger frame, I can now select deactivate the viewport, which is what I want. So it takes a little bit of, when you're going to use multiple viewports, it takes a little bit of experimentation to get things right. What I've also done here, notice that the schedule overlaps a decking area. What I've also done is create a layer, and I've made a layer called schedule mask, and I'll OK it. What I've done is, in fact, is to put a rectangle with a white fill on the right hand side there. So let's return to the layout sheet. What have we got? We've got a rectangle. What I'll now do is just change those floating viewports, the colour, back to 255, 255, so that it won't show. And that's what we can do, is use modify and match the properties, pick up the properties of that viewport and match them to that one. So now they're white on a white background and won't show. What I've done in that plant schedule one is just put a white background. This is just a rectangle with a fill on it, filled with transparency 255, and it's sitting behind the schedule. We can turn it on or off if I need to look at the schedule again, but I'm near the point where I want to print my drawing. So we have two floating viewports. Those floating viewports are just looking at what's in model space. There's actually very little drawn in the layout space. We do have a border. This particular designer likes to have a border around the whole sheet, and what I've done there, drawn that rectangle, I've given it a line weight, made it a relatively thick line, and I've said that the corner radius is 10 millimeters. This is an A3 sheet, and if you were in the imperial system, you'd be picking, say, an architectural B size sheet and putting a radius that was in decimal feet. But so we've got a nice curving corner. So if we pick the rectangle, you can see it's a rectangle and it gives us all the information we want. If we pick this particular entity, it's also in layout space and it's a block. So in layout space we can select it, that one and that one. There's really only two entities in layout space apart from the floating viewports. Let's go back to the model and zoom extents. So the details, everything in here is full size apart from that plant schedule, and when we come over here we're looking at a 1:50 scale. So we could actually pick our, sorry, I've got two things selected. If we pick that block, right click, what I'm trying to do is edit that block, and it won't let me. I have to come over here outside the floating viewport, and we can edit that piece of text and say that's 1:50 on at an A3. And you see that in your title block you give as much information as you want. The initials of who drafted it, the date at which it was prepared, your logo will sit in here, the address of the client. So it's just a matter of picking that's an M text box, and jump in here and you can edit the address. Leave the \P because that forces a new line. So that's a bit of M text in 3 lines, and I'll close my block editor and unselect all. So we've made the adjustment there. It becomes quite an easy adjustment. You might not need all the tender issue information and certification and so on, but this particular designer does. So what I'm trying to illustrate in this movie is that laying out a title block information with a border and your title block, you call the shots. There are lots of different ways of doing it. I've called this particular block a generic horizontal block, and I'll put a copy of it on the website for people to download and insert it and modify it if you like it and want to work with it. I'll put another one, a vertical version of that same logo and title block information. So what I'm aiming to do is to show lots of different ways of laying information out. In this particular drawing, we can go to a detail sheet, right click and zoom extents. You see now we've got a vertical block. We can go to the species and more species and more species. So I've currently got 3 sheets showing species detail. I think that's on a small sheet. We go here, that's on an A4 sheet. So a very small sheet that can be printed off on my little office printer, whereas I'd take the plan to a copy shop and print it in colour on an A3 sheet. So that's one little movie showing you different ways of using the layout space, and I would hope to add more movies and show the way different design drafters lay things out.